The wind came down from the hills like a quiet warning, carrying dust and the smell of dry grass as Jonah Reed rode alone along the narrow trail, his horse stepping carefully where the ground broke toward the river below, and though the sun was still high, the light felt tired, stretched thin over the wide land, and Jonah felt the same way, worn by miles and years that had pulled him farther from town and closer to a life he never meant to choose, a life shaped by silence, by long days trapping in the hills and longer nights staring into small fires, thinking of things he did not say and choices he did not undo, and when he reached the bend where the old cottonwood leaned like it always had, he slowed without meaning to, because memory lived there, waiting, as steady as the tree itself, and for a moment he saw her again in his mind, standing beneath its branches years ago, her dress pale against the dirt road, her eyes sharp and sad at once, asking him why he never stayed, why he always left just when things began to matter. And Jonah shook his head as if the thought were dust in his eyes, urging the horse forward toward town, because he had promised himself this trip would be quick, only supplies and a night's rest before returning to the quiet hills where no one asked questions, where no one expected him to be more than he was. Yet as the roofs came into view and the sound of life reached him, voices, a distant laugh, the clatter of hooves, his chest tightened in a way he did not welcome, because town meant people, and people meant remembering, and remembering had never been kind to him. Still he rode on, tying his horse near the post outside the general store, nodding to a few familiar faces without stopping, aware of how eyes followed him, not with fear or dislike but with curiosity, the kind reserved for men who come and go without explanation, men who belong nowhere fully. And inside the store the air was cool and smelled of coffee and leather, and as Jonah gathered flour and beans and salt, he felt a presence before he saw it, a stillness that drew his attention like a held breath, and when he turned, there she was, standing near the counter, older than the girl beneath the cottonwood but unmistakably the same, her hair darker, pulled back with care, her posture straighter, as if life had taught her to stand firm even when the ground shifted, and her name came to him before he could stop it, Mara Ellison, a name he had carried quietly through winters and miles, never spoken aloud, and for a long moment neither of them moved, the world narrowing to the space between them, filled with things unsaid, and then she looked at him fully, her eyes meeting his with a calm that unsettled him more than anger would have, and she said his name, not softly, not sharply, just plainly, as if it still belonged to him, and he answered in the same way, feeling the years collapse into a single beat of the heart, and around them the store carried on, unaware, while Jonah searched her face for signs of resentment or warmth and found something more careful, something guarded but not cold, and that hurt in a slow, steady way, because it meant she had learned to live without him, and as they spoke of small things, weather, the long winter past, the way the river had risen, Jonah felt the distance between them like a thin wall, not solid enough to block sound, but strong enough to keep them apart, and he wondered when it had been built. Whether he had laid each stone himself by leaving, by choosing the road again and again, telling himself it was easier than staying, and when he asked how she was, she paused just long enough for him to notice, then said she was well, that she worked at the boarding house now, that life was steady, and Jonah nodded, though the word steady felt foreign to him, because his life had been anything but, and as he paid for his goods, he told himself this meeting was chance, nothing more, that he would leave town by morning and the space between them would stretch wide again, safe and familiar. Yet when he stepped outside and felt the late sun on his face, he knew something had shifted, because the quiet hills no longer felt like refuge but like retreat, and as he loaded his supplies, Mara came out too, stopping a few steps away, and there was a question in her eyes she did not ask, and Jonah sensed that if he left now, it would settle things in a way that could not be undone, so he stayed, leaning against the post, listening as she spoke about the boarding house guests, the travelers passing through, the way the town seemed smaller and larger at the same time, and he realized he was listening not just to her words but to the spaces between them, the pauses where emotion rested without name, and when the sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the street, Mara felt quiet, and Jonah felt the weight of his own thoughts press forward, urging him to speak, to say something true, something that reached beyond weather and work, but truth had always been a hard road for him, and he stood there, feeling the old habit of distance rise like a shield, and then she looked at him again, really looked, and asked, "Are you staying long?" And the question was simple, but it carried years in it, and Jonah felt the answer form before he could shape it, uncertain and fragile, because he did not know anymore, because for the first time the idea of leaving felt heavier than staying, and as he opened his mouth, unsure what promise he could make without breaking it, a bell rang down the street and someone called Mara's name, and she turned halfway, then paused, waiting, giving him that moment, and Jonah understood then that whatever he said next would matter, not just to her but to the man he was becoming, and as the evening light faded and the air cooled, he stood there, caught between the hills and the town, between silence and the risk of being known, and the story of what came next hovered, unspoken, in the space between them. The day the widow came to Red Mesa, the heat lay heavy on the land like a held breath, and the town felt it before anyone saw her, a quiet unease moving through the dusty street as if the desert itself had shifted, and when she finally appeared at the edge of town riding a dark horse at a steady pace, heads turned slowly, not with curiosity alone but with something closer to caution, because her name had arrived long before she had, carried by traders and drifters who spoke it low and then changed the subject. Lena Crow, the widow of Red Mesa, a woman said to bring an ending with every love she dared to hold, and she rode past the saloon, past the church with its crooked cross, past men who tipped their hats without smiling, and she did not look at them, not out of pride but out of habit, as if meeting eyes invited questions she no longer had the strength to answer, and she stopped at the small adobe house at the edge of town where the desert opened wide and endless behind it, a place long empty, long avoided, and she dismounted with care, her black dress simple and worn, her movements calm, and if there was sorrow in her, it was not loud, it lived deep, like water beneath hard ground. And that first night, Red Mesa watched from a distance, waiting for something to happen, because with Lena Crow, something always did, yet the night passed quietly, and the stars burned bright and cold, and the widow lit a lamp and unpacked few things, a kettle, a blanket, a photograph she did not hang but placed face down in a drawer, and when she finally slept, it was light and dreamless, because memory had taught her not to rest too deeply, and the next evening, as the sun fell red and fierce behind the mesas, a sound came to her door, not a knock but a weight, a body slipping down the wood and settling there as if the earth itself had given him up, and when Lena opened the door, she found a man collapsed at her feet, dust-covered, blood dark against his shirt but not fresh enough to frighten her, his breathing shallow, his face lined with pain and stubborn wool, and she did not hesitate, because fear had left her years ago, and she dragged him inside with strength earned from surviving alone, laid him on the narrow bed, and cleaned the wound with steady hands, never asking his name, never wondering why he had come, because fate had a way of choosing for her. And as the night deepened, the man stirred, murmuring words she could not catch, and Lena sat nearby, listening, not with hope but with an old, familiar ache, because she knew this shape of beginning, the quiet arrival, the wounded man, the way care could turn slowly into something softer, something dangerous, and by morning the town knew, because Red Mesa always knew, and whispers moved like wind-blown sand, the widow had taken in a gunslinger, a man with trouble written into his bones, and they shook their heads, because it never ended well, and when the man finally woke fully, his eyes met Lena's with surprise and something like relief, and he told her his name was Caleb Hale, said it simply, without pride, as if names had lost their weight long ago, and Lena told him hers in return, watching the recognition flicker and then settle into something careful, and she said nothing of the stories, because she was tired of defending herself against ghosts, and Caleb stayed, because he could not yet walk far, and days passed slow and hot, the desert stretching endlessly outside the window, and they spoke little at first, sharing space rather than stories, but silence has a way of drawing people closer when it is shared, and Caleb noticed how Lena moved through the house like someone used to listening for danger, how her eyes tracked the horizon even while pouring water, how sadness rested on her without bending her spine, and Lena noticed the way Caleb carried pain without complaint, how he thanked her for small kindnesses as if they were rare gifts, and how at night he stared at the ceiling as though expecting it to fall, and gradually, words came, careful and spaced, and Caleb spoke of running from things he could not outride, of choices made too young and paid for too long, and Lena listened, because listening had become her way of loving without naming it, and she told him of the men she had lost, not in detail, not in drama, but in truth, each one taken by a life that did not allow softness to survive, and she said she did not believe herself cursed, but she did believe she stayed too long with men who were already halfway gone, and Caleb did not argue, did not reassure her with easy lies, he only said he was tired of running, and something in the way he said it made her chest tighten, because she had heard that hope before, and still, days turned into weeks, and the town watched as Caleb healed and did not leave, as laughter, soft and brief, slipped out of Lena's house now and then, and some men warned him, others envied him, and Lena felt the pull of feeling return like a slow tide, unwelcome and irresistible, and she fought it in small ways, keeping distance, speaking plainly, reminding herself of endings. But one evening, as the sun burned low and Caleb stood beside her outside, leaning heavier on his good leg, he said quietly, "You don't look at me like you expect me to die." And Lena looked at him then, really looked, and felt the dangerous warmth of wanting something she could not protect, and she said, "I don't look at you like I expect anything." And he smiled, not hurt, but understanding, and the desert listened, holding its breath, because peace never lasted long in Red Mesa. And trouble came as it always did, riding hard and fast, wearing familiar faces from Caleb's past, and Lena felt it before she saw it, that tightening in the air, that old sense of counting heartbeats. And when the riders appeared at the edge of town, dust rising behind them, Caleb reached for his gun out of habit, then stopped, looking at Lena, and she knew then that love, real love, was not the fire that burned bright, but the fear that came with knowing what you stood to lose. And as the town drew inward and doors closed and eyes watched, Lena stood at her doorway with the desert wind at her back, knowing the stories would either be proven or broken, and somewhere between the setting sun and the first star, fate leaned close, ready to choose again. Deadwood Crossing lay open to the sky like a wound that had never healed, its main street wide and empty, its buildings leaning with the tired patience of things long abandoned by hope. And when the rider appeared at dawn, moving slow through the dust with his shoulders bent and his coat faded nearly the color of the earth, no one rushed to greet him, because Deadwood Crossing had learned not to expect help, not from men, not from law, not from promises that rode in on tired horses. Yet the rider kept coming, past the broken hitching posts and the shuttered windows, until he stopped in front of what had once been the marshal's office, and for a long moment he sat there, breathing through old pain, his hand resting near a badge pinned to his chest, dulled by time but still catching the light. And his name was Thomas Hale, though few here knew it yet, and fewer still would care, because Deadwood Crossing had not seen a marshal in years, not since the last one failed them and died trying to fix what could not be fixed. And Thomas slid down from his horse with care, his knee stiff, his back marked by scars earned in places he no longer spoke of, and as he tied the reins, he felt the familiar weight of memory settle in, because this town looked too much like another one, another crossing where he had once worn that badge with pride and learned too late how heavy it could be. And inside the office the dust lay thick, papers yellowed and curled, the jail cells empty but not forgotten, and Thomas stood there alone, listening to the silence, hearing echoes that did not belong to Deadwood Crossing but followed him all the same, the sound of gunfire too late, the sound of a woman crying out his name, the sound of his own voice promising safety he could not deliver. And he closed his eyes until the present came back into focus, because he had not come here to remember, he had come because running had finally grown heavier than staying, and word spread quickly, as it always did in places with little else to talk about, that a marshal had ridden in, and by midday a few townsfolk gathered at a distance, watching him from doorways and porches, their faces worn but alert, and Thomas met their looks without asking for trust, because trust was not given in Deadwood Crossing, it was tested. And an older man named Jacob Rourke spoke first, his voice rough with years of dust and disappointment, asking if Thomas meant to stay or was just passing through. And Thomas answered honestly, saying he did not know how long he would last, but he knew he could not leave yet. And that honesty, plain and unpolished, carried more weight than any speech. And as the day wore on, Thomas learned the shape of the town's trouble, the gang that ruled from the ridge, men who took what they wanted and called it order, who planned to ride down soon and make Deadwood Crossing choose between submission and fire. And as the townspeople spoke, Thomas felt the old pull of duty rise against the fear he had spent years feeding, because he knew this pattern too well, knew how it ended when courage came too late. And that night, as he sat alone in the office with a lamp burning low, he took the badge off his chest and set it on the desk, staring at it as if it might answer him, because the truth was he had sworn never to wear it again, not after the last town, not after the failure that had cost him his partner, his wife, and his belief that law could save anyone. And sleep came only in pieces, broken by dreams where the past replayed itself without mercy. And when morning came, Thomas stepped back into the street with the badge still on the desk behind him, intending to speak with the town without it, to offer help as a man, not a marshal. But fate did not wait, and the first shots rang out near the edge of town, not a full attack, just a warning, and the people scattered as panic flared, and Thomas moved without thinking, dragging a wounded boy into cover, pressing cloth to blood, his hands steady despite the tremor inside. And as he worked, he heard someone shout for the marshal, and the word cut deeper than any blade, because it carried expectation. And Thomas looked down at the boy, at the fear in his eyes, and something hardened in him, not pride, not anger, but resolve shaped by regret, and he stood and ran back to the office, grabbed the badge, pinned it back where it belonged, and when he stepped into the street again, the town saw the difference, not in his posture alone but in the way he met danger head-on, and he spoke plainly, telling them what he could and could not promise, telling them that survival would cost courage and unity, and some listened while others doubted, but no one turned away, because fear had already taken its toll and there was little left to lose, and as preparations began, Thomas walked the town, setting guards, repairing what defenses could be repaired, and with each step he felt the weight of his past press closer, whispering that he would fail again, that history did not bend for second chances, and that night, as he stood at the edge of town watching the dark hills where the gang would come from, he spoke aloud to the ghosts that followed him, to the woman he had loved, to the partner he had buried, saying he was tired of running, tired of living as if one failure defined everything that followed, and the wind carried his words away, but something inside him settled, because facing the ghosts was not about defeating them, it was about standing still while they passed through, and dawn broke red and hard, and the riders appeared as expected, dust rising like a storm, and Deadwood Crossing held its breath, and Thomas stood in the open street, badge catching the sun, gun at his side but not raised, because this was the moment he had feared and prepared for, the moment where choice mattered more than outcome, and as the gang leader called out, mocking the idea of law returning to a dead place, Thomas felt the old fear rise and then fall away, replaced by a calm he had not known in years, because whatever happened next, he would not turn away, and as the first step toward violence was taken, Deadwood Crossing watched its last marshal stand firm, and the past and present collided in a single heartbeat, promising either redemption or ruin, and the story of which would come next hung heavy in the air, waiting for the trigger that would decide it. The canyon waited long before Eli Mercer ever found the map, waiting in the way deep places do, patient and unmoved by the passing of men and years, and when Eli first unrolled the brittle scrap of paper beneath the dim light of his camp lantern, he felt the weight of that waiting settle into his bones, because Black Canyon was not a name spoken lightly, not by prospectors who had seen too much desert, not by tribes who knew how land remembered, and not by towns that still whispered about men who went searching for gold and returned thinner, quieter, or not at all. Yet desperation has a voice louder than caution, and Eli knew it well, had followed it across dry plains and into colder nights than he could count, driven by debts, by a promise to a sister waiting far east, and by the quiet fear of becoming a man whose life left no mark at all, and the map had come to him by accident, slipped from the lining of a dying man's coat in a roadside tent where Eli had shared water and silence with a stranger whose eyes flickered with both hope and regret, and the man had said only one thing before his breath faded, telling Eli not to listen to the canyon when it began to speak, and that warning stayed with him as he packed his mule and turned south, following the marks drawn in trembling ink, each mile taking him farther from familiar ground and closer to a place the desert seemed to hide from the sun itself, and at first the journey was quiet, the land stretching open and honest, but as the red walls of Black Canyon rose from the earth like a great scar, the air changed, thickened, carrying a hush that pressed against Eli's ears, and it was there, at the canyon's edge, that he first heard it, not a voice exactly, more like a murmur beneath the wind, soft and uncertain, as if the stone itself were breathing, and Eli told himself it was imagination, the product of long travel and longer need, and he climbed down into the canyon where shadows clung even at midday, and the map guided him deeper, past narrow passages where sound bent and returned to him altered, until the whispers grew clearer, shaping words he could almost understand, promises made in a tone that felt familiar, intimate, calling his name as if spoken by someone who had known him once, and Eli stopped more than once, pressing his hands against the rock, steadying himself, reminding himself that gold had driven many men mad before it ever made them rich, yet the whispers did not demand at first, they only offered, showing him glimpses in his mind of a small house near green water, of his sister smiling without worry, of a life where hunger no longer dictated every choice, and he pressed on, heart pounding, because hope can feel like truth when it arrives quietly, and at night he camped beneath the stars where the canyon opened briefly to the sky, and there the voices gathered closer, no longer scattered but joined, speaking in harmony that felt almost kind, telling him the gold was near, that it was waiting for hands brave enough to claim it, and Eli answered without meaning to, asking what price it wanted, and the canyon fell silent, a silence so complete it rang, and when the whispers returned, they did not answer directly, only reminding him of what he stood to gain, and the next day he found the vein, hidden behind a curtain of stone just as the map had promised, gold threaded through the rock like captured sunlight, more than he had ever seen, more than he could have dreamed, and his breath caught, joy and fear tangling together. Because beauty of that kind rarely came without shadow, and as he reached out to touch it, the whispers rose again, no longer soft but insistent, telling him to take it, to take all of it, and Eli worked through the day, his hands shaking as he chipped away, each strike echoing too loudly, and with every piece he gathered, the voices grew clearer, more demanding, reminding him of moments he had failed, of chances he had missed, of people he had disappointed, and he realized then that the canyon did not create desire, it only reflected it, feeding on what already lived inside a man, and that night, as he slept fitfully, he dreamed of the dying stranger, standing at the canyon's mouth, shaking his head, and when Eli woke, the whispers had changed, no longer promising but insisting, telling him the gold was not enough, that to keep it he must give something back, something equal in weight, and Eli's fear sharpened, because he understood then what the old stories meant by curse, not a devil with horns and fire, but a bargain that asked for pieces of the soul, traded slowly, willingly, and when he tried to leave the next morning, the canyon seemed to twist, passages narrowing, familiar turns leading him back again and again, and the voices grew louder, accusing him of weakness, of ingratitude, and Eli fell to his knees, pressing his hands to his ears, shouting that he wanted no part of it, and for a moment, the canyon answered with laughter, low and echoing, and then with a question, asking him what he was willing to lose to keep what he had found, and Eli thought of his sister, of the quiet life he had imagined, and he felt the terrible clarity of truth settle over him, that no gold could buy peace built on fear, and with shaking hands he gathered the pieces he had taken and carried them back to the hidden vein, returning them to the rock one by one, apologizing aloud, not to the canyon but to himself, and as the last piece was set back in place, the whispers faltered, then faded, retreating like a tide pulling away from shore, and the canyon opened its paths again, allowing him to climb out beneath a sky that felt wider than it had days before, and Eli did not look back as he left Black Canyon behind, carrying no gold but something heavier and more valuable, the knowledge of the line he would not cross, and when he reached the open desert, the wind rose and erased his tracks, and the whispers followed no farther, remaining where they belonged, waiting for the next man desperate enough to listen.